Hello and welcome back to Fullerton College's Print 101 Intro to Print. This is Professor Ben Kiewit, and today we're going to go through sheet-fed press operation, which comes from Chapter 16 in our graphic communications book. You know, one of the things I like about this book, and one of the reasons we keep using this slightly older edition in our class, is because with this edition, the chapters on press work are just about as good as a manual to help you actually operate a press. I've actually used them myself when I was learning how to use some of these equipments. You can refer to some of these chapters and actually use them as a practical field guide to problem solving on press. One of the reasons I'm leaving this chapter in here too. The sheet-fed press operation. It's a very valuable chapter. Anyways, in the background of the picture here is the Heidelberg we have, the Speedmaster 5200. This is actually our print lab on campus. How I miss it. Anyways, the principles of offset press operation, the methods, the techniques, in fact, many of the systems, while they may vary slightly from press to press, in fact, it's pretty common across all sheet-fed offset litho presses. They all use the same types of systems. They all have the same types of problems. There may be a slightly different tool that you adjust to make the adjustments, but the adjustments being made are always the same across all these presses. So everything from a small offset duplicator up to these large industrial multicolor presses all work on the same principles. So let's dive in. I may have slightly spoiled this in the last chapter talking about cylinder packing, and I didn't actually have the slides to support myself. Sometimes I get ahead of myself because I'm so excited to talk about something. So cylinder packing. You add layers of material below the surface of cylinders to make sure that there's the right amount of pressure for transfer. If you want more pressure on a press, you need to make the cylinders touch more. The more the cylinders overlap each other, we're talking the plate and the blanket here, because the blanket because it's a rubber, soft, squishy blanket, you have the ability to squish into it. The more you squish into the blanket, the more pressure is applied between the two. In order to get the correct amount of pressure, therefore, you must make sure that the two plates touch the right amount. And to do that, you change the circumference of the cylinders. While it could be possible to pack behind the plate cylinder, this is not a great idea and can lead to a lot of problems. Therefore, we pack and put extra material behind the blanket cylinder. And the extra cushion underneath the blanket cylinder helps make sure you get the right amount of pressure. So there are layers of material, sometimes very thin, sometimes a little thicker, with just enough resistance and just enough give that goes behind the blanket to make sure that it's pressing hard enough against the plate cylinder. To do this, you have to be able to measure it precisely. But we'll talk about that a little later. Let's talk about feeding systems here. So again, this whole chapter is simply on sheet-fed offset printing. Web-fed offset printing is almost only in the realm of newspapers. Although not exclusively, sheet-fed is more common for most print shops around the country, around the world, and most print jobs that are done on sheet-fed. So the feeder systems on the left here, we have successive sheet feeding where the machine will pick up one sheet at a time completely. It picks up one, it puts it all the way into the machine, and the machine starts running it before it goes back to pick up the next one. There's also something called a stream feed. And a stream feed is like when you take a deck of playing cards and you spread them out on the table in front of you like a really cool dealer at a casino or something. Not that I would know, I'm actually really awful at card games. Let's play for fun and put a little money on it, right, guys? Chuckle, chuckle, not a shark. Anyways, actually, I'm really not. So stream feed, you're laying the sheets on top, or the machine lays the sheets on top of each other, and then it will take them as it needs them from that stream. Stream feeding is faster, though a little harder to control than successive feeding. Successive feeding is more common on smaller, simpler presses, and stream feeding is more common on larger, more complicated, more industrial scaled presses. Now, to mount plates. These are actually the steps to mounting plate cylinders. Here's what you got to do. Step 1, you actually need to clean and dry the plate cylinder. Even a wet plate cylinder can mess you up. So it needs to be clean and dry. No debris, no old ink, no old chemicals, no lint, nothing. clean, all the way clean. Then you rotate it around till you find the head clamp. The head clamp, this is a bad picture for it. It's the best photo I could find online of one of these. And the pictures I was taking in the lab turned out pretty awful. So here's an online picture, guys. This one's a magnetic system, which is not going to show the clamp, but at least the attachment point is still in the place where a clamp could have been. So you clamp the lead edge in place. Then you hold the tail end, which is the end not clamped, and you rotate the press slowly. Oftentimes you're turning the cylinder by hand on a hand crank and maintaining tension on the other side to wrap it around tightly and hopefully straightly. And once it's all the way around the cylinder, then you clamp the tail end in, and then you can adjust the clamps until they're straighter and tighter. Now let's talk about setting up the cylinders. Did you know that a lot of offset presses, when you set up to print, you're not just setting up, you're actually assembling the press. That's right. When you're not in use, a press will find itself in pieces. And that's not a problem. That's a design feature. There are so many small rolls and so many confined spaces on these machines that it's actually a lot easier to be able to reach in and clean things properly and keep the machine maintained if some of these parts simply come out. So sometimes, I mean, some bigger presses you may not do this with, but on many presses, you'll have to install the parts as you set it up to print. So the first thing you do is you set up your plate cylinder, which we talked about in the last slide. You get the plate attached, wrapped, and aligned as best you can. Then you clean the blanket and you adjust the blanket packing if you need to. We'll talk more about that too in a minute, about the methods of doing that. Then you want to set up the impression cylinder to give the right amount of press against the blanket cylinder. Make sure, again, it is clean and dry. Wow, clean and, wow, there's a good ham-handed typing. I guess my fingers were slurring their speech a little there. Clean and dry. Oh no, clean and dry, never mind. There's an and there, cleaned and dry. Well, I guess we could add an apostrophe, do like a pre-dictionary spelling, back when the English language was a bit more loose with the spelling and people would write everything phonetically as they thought it. Good times back before the Regency period, and they nailed that down. Curse you, Webster. Anyways, so you want to make sure you have the right amount of pressure between the impression and the offset or blanket cylinder, because that's what's going to take the pressure. So that pressure is going to take the ink off the blanket and put it on your substrate, which is mostly paper if you're running an offset press. So the cylinder packing guide is the easy way of knowing if your cylinders are packed the right amount. The cylinder packing guide can actually measure these things for you. It's a specialized caliper or micrometer that will measure the distances involved with the cylinder to make, or sorry, with the blanket to make sure that it's sticking out the exact right amount, to make sure it's pressing the exact right amount against that plate to get the exact right amount of ink transferred. The packing gauge is a great tool that saves you a lot of trouble. It's possible with good rulers and some good math to calculate the packing necessary using our old friend Pi. It was just Pi Day recently, wasn't it? And a lot of time on a calculator or by hand if you are a masochist. Anyways, masochist. Ooh, how did it take me this long to come up with that word? A masochist, someone who prefers to use the painful method of hand math. Wow. All right. Somebody call Urban Dictionary. I'm getting on there. So we're moving on from here. So packing gauge will do that for you. You got to love when tools do your math. It's quite nice. Lets you do your other jobs easier. So then we have to set up the dampening system. We talked about this a little bit last time. What makes an offset press and one of the key features of an offset press. If you're looking at a press and you're not sure what kind of system it is, and you've never heard of that brand before, or someone has gone by and popped all the brand names off, so you can't go by that. You have to look at a press and tell what kind of press am I looking at. The existence of a fountain system or a dampening system will tell you that it's an offset press. So when you're setting it up, the first thing you do is you formulate your fountain solution. Remember, your fountain solution is distilled water, gum arabic, and a little bit of phosphorus acid. Typically speaking, you don't have to find those things separately and make a witch's brew to put on there, but you'll buy a jug of pre-mixed concentrate. We talked about this last time as well. It's kind of like those jugs of concentrated fruit punch you get at summer camp, where they pour it into the giant igloo cooler and either add way too much water and make everybody sad, or not enough and make all the kids hyper. Anyways, both the scenarios have happened to me in my life. But anyways, it's the same sort of thing. You add water to so you add the solution to a water to make, or the concentrate to the water to make a solution. Then you adjust the flow. Adjusting the flow will happen multiple ways. The flow can be managed by the ductor roller, which is letter D on the diagram here, and the ductor goes back and forth. The ductor can either go back and forth in a more staccato method, where it spends very little time touching the fountain and very little time touching the rollers that actually put water onto the plate, or it can do a more legato type tapping, where it will spend more time touching both, and that will allow it to transfer more water. So you're able to meter the amount of fountain solution / water, I'm using the words interchangeably here, by how frequent and how long, by just basically the amount of contact the ductor has with the fountain and with the rolls. And you adjust the roller pressure to make sure they're pressing the right amount to meter the right amount of water. Some systems do not have a ductor. Some systems will be a continuous dampening system where it will simply continue to put water on, and you use pressure between the rollers to meter the amount as opposed to a ductor, although the traditional ductor system is more common. And of course, when we're all done, what do? We clean up after ourselves. That's what I have to tell my 4-year-old. Whatever you're doing, your job isn't done until you've cleaned it up. Yes, you've made your craft, but the craft isn't done until you throw away the paper scraps and put the paint back in the drawer. Anyways, you need to clean this up when you're done. I know you're thinking it's only solution, it's just water, but it builds deposits, it leaves stuff behind, and it will ruin your press if you don't clean it up. So please, clean your press when you're done using it. Especially if you're using one of my presses, then you better clean that up. Okay, let's talk about ink problems. I got 99 problems and ink is most of them. So this is a fun little diagram of different types of ink issues you can have on a press. It's called, they have names for them. Basically, depending on the pressure and shape of the rolls involved of taking the ink from the inking fountain onto the press, onto the plate, it's going to have different problems. So if it's pressing too hard against the fountain roller, the ink fountain roller, or the ink roller, you're going to get something called wide ink, which means if you're pushing too hard, there's more surface contact. Think like low air pressure in a tire on a car or a bike. You can see at the bottom, it squishes flatter, right? When there's too much pressure for the amount of air pressure inside. So that's wide ink too. If they're pressing too hard, the ink is going to spread out too much. The opposite problem is narrow ink. Narrow ink means there's not enough pressure and they're not touching hard enough to transfer enough ink to get a good print. Wide ink and narrow ink are easy problems to solve. And so we have the wide ink, the narrow ink, and uneven ink, which is the pressure is not even. One side is pushing harder than the other. Now, these three have something in common, and the other two have something in common with each other. These three problems for inking are solvable by adjusting the pressure and how the roll seats into the press. There may be some presses where you're not able to work with the uneven pressure. That may not be adjustable on some. On most, you can do a little bit of adjustment somewhere, turning a little screw to change how hard each side pushes. Those are all things you can solve through machine calibration. However, the last two, the wide at ends or wide at middle, that's not something you can do anything about simply by adjusting the machine. Those require you to replace the rollers. If the ends swell, that has to do with it running towards the end of its life and the rubber of the roller is typically a rubber, becoming too absorbent and allowing moisture in, and then it swells up. Likewise, if it gets big in the middle, but the ends have less ink, then you're talking about a roller that's getting worn out on the sides. Like it ran down, kind of like when you walk in shoes for too long, and if you're like me and you walk heel heavy, the heel wears right off, and the toes still look new. Thank you, marching band. Anyways, when that happens, you need a new pair of shoes. I mean, you need a new roller for your press. So in fact, it's probably a good idea, depending on the type of press, and if you're setting up your own business, here's my little piece of business advice for you. Inking rollers are consumables, not necessarily parts that are going to stay around forever. Don't think of them like your plate cylinder, your blanket cylinder, your impression cylinder. They're going to live on the press for the life of the press. Ink rollers kind of come and go because you use them and after a while they wear out. So consider them consumables, even if they're not frequently consumed. All right, we're going to pause here. We'll come back to another video to finish off this lecture.